Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. The player experience in role-playing games can depend on a lot of things. One of the major features that can heavily impact your whole experience is the perspective from which you consume the content in the game. In other words, different camera options. These two camera modes are so different and they can affect the gameplay in various ways. While most action RPGs are only playable in one of these camera modes, there are a handful of games that allow you to use both. And while this sounds like a great idea on paper, it's almost certain that one of those camera modes will be far superior. I am always for more player options, but I'm not so crazy about half-baked and tacked-on features. There are some games that are using one of these camera modes exclusively in some situations, usually because of the technical limitations of their default camera modes. We're going to talk about everything related to these two camera modes, their advantages, limitations, and my overall thoughts about these particular features. Let's start with the first-person camera modes. I'm not here to give you a history lesson, but we have to mention where it all started. Ultima Underworld was one of the first RPGs that played entirely in the first-person mode. It offered a really unique and immersive experience that we didn't see before in a role-playing game. Just a couple of years after, the first Elder Scrolls game came out, and it was undoubtedly heavily inspired by Ultima Underworld, but it had much higher ambitions. The first-person perspective was still a new concept back then, well, at least for RPGs. But as a concept, the first-person perspective in RPGs didn't really blow up, which is not surprising at all actually. Apart from Elder Scrolls games, there is just a handful of action RPGs with this feature. The list is even shorter if we exclude shooter RPGs like Deus Ex and newer Fallout series. A couple of older RPGs that are definitely worth mentioning are Arx Fatalis and Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. Those RPGs played exclusively in first person, and both of those games were pretty good in general. The reason for such a low interest in making these types of RPGs is technical limitations. Making a good action melee combat in this perspective is a great challenge. It's undoubtedly a lot harder than making a third-person action combat system. I'm putting a strong emphasis on the word action, which basically means every RPG that plays in real time and requires at least a certain dose of proper reaction time from the player. But anyway, before we start talking about some specific limitations of this camera mode, let's mention all the positive stuff and why would you want to experience the game like this. Immersion is the most obvious answer for most people, and I would definitely agree. You're playing the game through the eyes of your character, which makes some activities like exploring a lot more immersive. And speaking about exploring, indoor areas and tight corridors are much easier to explore in this camera mode by default. This actually leans toward technical side of things, so it's not like the first person mode only has technical limitations like I mentioned above. That part is almost strictly related to combat mechanics, not exploration, but we'll get to that. For example, when I'm playing Skyrim, I like to switch camera modes in different situations. I'm pretty much always using a third-person camera in big open areas, and I switch to first-person when I'm going through tight dungeons and indoor areas. But whenever I start a fight though, I always prefer to be in third-person. Which is kinda ironic because Elder Scrolls games are definitely meant to be played in first-person. Bethesda did improve the third-person mode in Skyrim a lot compared to their previous games. It's at least playable compared to Oblivion and Morrowind. But it was still a lot worse compared to first person. At least that's the case when we're talking about the vanilla game. You can substantially improve the third person with mods. And if you like to use some combat mods that add a lot of features which will make the combat more action oriented, the third person is the way to go. But of course, all of this is totally optional, yet some people get really pissed off in the comments. They be like, dodging is so unrealistic, why would you want that in Skyrim? Well, hitting a guy with a heavy-ass sword in the face like 30 times in a row is also unrealistic, but you don't seem to have a problem with that. Bitch. Anyway, I have a lot of videos about Skyrim's combat mods, so you can check that out if you're interested. While we're still talking about Skyrim, there is another thing I want to mention. Playing with a bow in first person is an amazing experience. There are some games with an amazing bow gameplay in third person, and we talked about this on the channel as well. But no matter how good are the bow mechanics in third person, the feeling you get while aiming your bow manually in first person is something really unique. It's a completely different experience, and it's also kinda related to immersion, but it's not only that. Even in games where the first-person camera feels like an afterthought, like in Gothic 3 for example, using a bow is still really satisfying. I bet that a lot of people didn't even know that this game had a first-person mode. It's absolutely abysmal for anything else than exploring and using a bow occasionally. The reason why the bow gameplay feels really good in first person is probably because mechanically it's really similar to first person shooters. It's basically a projectile based weapon with a really slow fire rate. Speaking about projectile based weapons, we have to mention Cyberpunk 2077. Back in 2019, we got a confirmation that Cyberpunk will only be playable in first person. Senior level designer Miles Toast said that Cyberpunk just wouldn't work as a third person game. This is exactly why we have the whole first person thing in there, right? For us as a studio of storytellers, it's almost like a natural evolution of how we make an immersive narrative or how we get you to be immersed within the story. As you could hear, he mentioned immersion quite a bit there. Combining RPG and first person shooter elements is a great idea, if executed properly of course. But I have no doubts in my mind that Cyberpunk will be a full-blown RPG that plays in first person, and not a first-person shooter with RPG elements.
Like me?
No. Even though Cyberpunk will play in first person, I really hope we get to see some abilities in third person. Remember when I mentioned that some games are using one of these camera modes exclusively in some situations? If you don't know what I'm talking about, the best example would be Destiny 2. Destiny 2 plays like a first-person shooter, but when you get to use some abilities or special weapons, the game will switch the perspective to third person, and it just works. Destiny 2 has some amazing shooter mechanics in general, so I wouldn't mind to see something similar in Cyberpunk 2077. This particular feature of switching the perspective feels great, at least in my opinion. Now let's talk about some limitations of this camera mode. You probably at least heard about Kingdom Come Deliverance. It's a medieval action RPG that focuses on realism and real history. I always find it hard to compare this game to basically any other action RPG because it offers a really specific experience. It knows what it's trying to be and it goes all in. By the way, I really want to do a review for this game in the near future. Anyway, this game is a great example of some technical limitations which this camera mode can have. Kingdom Come Deliverance had a couple of interesting old trailers which basically alluded that the game will have some big open fights. You could say this was just a false advertising of the game features, but I truly believe that Warhorse Studio didn't have bad intentions. They probably had plans to include such fights in the game because this whole project was really ambitious. If you visit their Kickstarter campaign page, you can still find this part about enormous open field battles and sieges. I don't wanna spoil anything, but nothing like this ever happens in the game. The first-person camera was definitely one of the reasons for the lack of big fights. The way that combat works is also not really suitable for fights with multiple opponents. But even if it was, it would be really difficult to create large-scale battles that feel good in this camera mode. Mount & Blade games can give you a good example when it comes to this. Even though these games always had a first-person camera mode, playing like this in large fights is really awkward. It's definitely immersive, don't get me wrong, but that doesn't matter much if the game doesn't control well. It's not entirely impossible in all scenarios. For example, it's really fun to use a bow or a crossbow in first person when you're defending a castle. But when you engage in a big fight on the open field, it's just a bad idea. So yeah, I think it's not hard to see the limitations of this camera mode. However, we got a new RPG from Obsidian to look forward to. Avowed is a first-person action RPG, and it will be really interesting to see how the gameplay feels. Now let's talk about the third-person camera mode. This camera mode is definitely preferred by most action RPG developers, and it's not hard to see why. Over the years, we could see a lot of third-person action RPGs, and it basically became a default camera mode for these games. The combat in every modern action RPG usually have at least some skill requirements. When this is the case, the third-person perspective has a lot of advantages. First of all, it's much easier to see what's going on around you, which makes it much easier to react properly. Just try to imagine playing any Dark Souls games in first person, or The Witcher 3, or any other similar RPG with action-based combat. It's just not feasible. And even if it was, these games would be much different. So the action combat is obviously favored by this camera mode, when it's done properly of course. It's not perfect obviously, a lot can go wrong like animations, hit feedback, hitboxes and all sorts of things. And since I mentioned animations, third-person RPGs have to worry about this a lot more. First person is obviously limited when it comes to your character animations. There is only so much you can do with animations in this perspective. On the other hand, third person doesn't have these problems. Game developers have a lot more freedom when it comes to this. Being able to actually see your character is also a big deal in my opinion. I love the visual progression in action RPGs, so when I get a new shiny piece of gear, I prefer to be able to see it on my character. Otherwise, obtaining a new piece of gear is just a stat upgrade, which is not that exciting. I think that's one of the reasons why Bethesda started to include a third-person mode in their games. Like we mentioned before, Morrowind and Oblivion are almost unplayable in third person when it comes to combat mechanics. But it's nice to have the option to see your character in third person every once in a while, especially when you get some new gear. So even though these games were almost unplayable like this, I'm really glad they have it as an option. We talked a lot about immersion when it comes to the first person camera, but that doesn't mean that third person perspective can't be immersive. In fact, one of the most immersive RPGs that I played is in third person. It's not impossible to create an immersive game in this perspective, that's all what I'm trying to say, but it's definitely harder. I think some sort of dynamic camera is the future for action RPGs. As technology moves forward, game developers with a lot of resources will start utilizing both of these camera features, using the best from both worlds basically. A glimpse of this can be seen in Destiny 2, like I already mentioned, but that's probably just the beginning. There could be more games that do this, Destiny 2 is just on top of my mind. In the end, it all depends from the game itself and what exactly it's trying to achieve. But in the present day and age, making an action RPG that has both of these camera features is a great challenge. It's almost like trying to make two games at the same time. So trying to create dynamic camera just makes more sense. Or just stick with one of those camera modes. Those are just my opinions about this topic and I would like to hear yours in the comments below. Before I started making this video, I made a poll on my community page. And as you can see from 1600 votes, third person won by quite a bit. But the poll is still open, you can go and vote if you wish. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting and if you did, pressing the thumbs up button would mean a lot. I have a lot of similar RPG discussion videos, so you can check that out if you're interested. Don't forget to subscribe for more content and click on the bell icon so you don't miss any future uploads. Special thanks to my Patreons, and if you as well want to become one of them, all the links are in the description. Patreon is definitely the best place to directly support my work and every contribution is highly appreciated. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.